Yeah.
Hello and good morning from Jakarta. Welcome to FPCI virtual public discussion titled The View from Outside, How Indonesians See Our Democracy, Election, and Political Development. I am Herza, and I will be the master of ceremony for today's event. This public discussion is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, and it is part one of Indonesianists virtual public discussion series. Today, I am pleased to welcome over 300 participants joining with us virtually. I would like to welcome our distinguished speakers. Thank you for joining us. Professor Donald K. Emerson, Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, Schwarzenstein, APARC, Stanford University. Professor Greg Barton, Chair in Global Islamic Politics, Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, allow me to invite our moderator, Dr. Dino Patijalal, founder and chairman of FPCI. Dr. Dino, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Herza, and I want to thank everyone who has joined here. We were informed we got 322 registrants from 31 countries. So welcome to all of you, and I encourage you to post your questions in the chat box, and we will proceed to your questions in the last half hour or so of our discussions. I want to thank everyone who I want to thank all the panelists who have agreed to join this panel on Indonesianist view on Indonesia's democracy and political development. Today we have two very distinguished Indonesianists. One is Professor Donald Emerson from Stanford, and Professor Greg Barton, who is the chair of Global Islamic Politics, Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalization in Australia. But Don is an old hand on Indonesia. I think when he was very, very young, I don't know what was his 60s or 70s, he spent time in Indonesia. He did research. He has warm stories about it. He returns to Indonesia all the time. He speaks Bahasa. And I've had a long, rich personal and intellectual relationship with him. And in my career as a diplomat, I always consulted him on how the United States or the world sees Indonesia and what Indonesia should be aware of, and so on. So he's definitely the right Indonesianist to speak about our politics today. And Professor Greg Barton is definitely a prominent Indonesianist from Australia. He's written tons of books on Islam in Indonesia, on Indonesian politics, and he's definitely an authority that we would be delighted to hear his views. I really thank you, Professor Greg and Professor Don. And also, I want to say thank you to Pak Don also. I know you have a lot of Indonesian students that you had discussions at Stanford. Maybe at some point today you can share with us your discussions with them and how they see Indonesia. Yeah. Let me first invite Professor Greg Barton to open this discussion by sharing your views on the state of Indonesia's democracy today, and then after that I go to Pak Don, and then we'll proceed from then. Yeah, please, Professor Greg.
Thank you, Pak Dino. Well, just very briefly, I'm glad that you didn't record a conversation with us 12 months ago, because I think we would look very foolish now. Certainly I would have, because I didn't see the situation coming weeks away from February 14 first round, that Pak Prabowo would be so comfortably in front, even to the point perhaps of getting a win in the first round. I'm thinking it's going to go to 2 rounds, but that surprised me. It's great to have a situation where half of the voters are millennial or Gen Z. That's wonderful. I didn't expect, to be frank, that voting population, according to the polls at least so far, would be so in favor of Pak Prabowo. Long story short, I interpret that as being that Prabowo is benefiting from the mandate of Pak Jokowi. Pak Jokowi, for many good reasons, not least economic performance, is extremely popular. And I think that Prabowo benefits from that popularity. 10 years ago, when we saw Prabowo in campaigning for the 2014 election, he was playing a classic populist role. He was literally a man on horseback at Bung Karno Stadium, channeling even Bung Karno himself as he appeared behind period microphones. He was an outsider wanting to disrupt, but he wasn't sufficiently popular to win. Now he's doing the reverse. He's not an outsider disrupting. He's an insider with the blessing of the president. I don't think he's any longer playing the role of a populist in a classic sense, but he's popular. You know, he's on his way to winning, and I didn't see that coming. My perspective is disappointment, but not despondency. This is a glass half full moment, and I think for old white guys like Don and myself who've watched Indonesia for decades, Indonesia is a glass half full kind of place. We should always be optimistic, but there's often disappointment. That's just the reality. But we shouldn't give up. So easy for us to say, but it's a privilege to be asked to say this and have this discussion today with a much younger, more engaged group. So Don will have his own take on this, but this is a very subjective and frankly a modest position, because I'm humbled by the fact that I've been blindsided and misread this whole series of political developments. I recognize there's been a slow decline in democracy under Jokowi, particularly the second term. I thought some of his critics were perhaps exaggerating the degree to which democracy was moving backwards. I'm now forced to acknowledge that they're probably right, but that doesn't mean that it's over. It just means we're entering a different phase of contestation. And perhaps an inflection point. Perhaps this is the point in which we, see a young Indonesia really engage with campaigning for democracy and defending it, because heavens knows that's what's going to be required, it would seem. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Greg. Professor Don, please. Sorry. Okay, so Professor Don is having some internet issues, so let me get back to you, Pak Greg. You spoke about democratic erosion. Can you describe what are the evidence of this democratic erosion, and why do you think that is happening? Because it seems to be happening not just in Indonesia, but also in other democracies as well.
Yeah, you're right, Pak Dino. I mean, 2024 is a year of elections globally, and in many countries those elections don't count for much, but in many countries these are really consequential. So elections in India, the biggest democracy, elections in America, facing a real existential threat to democracy with the prospect of a second Trump term. I think you're right. Democracy is challenged everywhere. It's under pressure. At the end of the day, that's partly to do with elites getting away with what they can, and obviously trying to back up their own power by shortcuts, and partly through a public that's switched off and not sufficiently engaged. That's always the combination at play. In Indonesia's case, to be fair, Pak Jokowi has been a very successful president. The economy is doing remarkably well. Consistently strong growth that began before his tenure, but carried on through his tenure. Relatively low inflation, relatively low unemployment. All of that is remarkable, and it therefore translates with good reason to him being popular. But he hasn't been a great Democrat, and in fact, he's less of a Democrat at the end of his second term than he was, coming into the office. And I think the evidence for the fact that he's not a great Democrat is his contempt for democratic institutions. So first we have attacks on the Commission for Human Rights, and then attacks on the Electoral Commission. either sort of direct attacks or white-handing, undermining. The evidence, unfortunately, appears to be that Pak Jokowi is not deeply committed to democratic reform and democratic institutions. And whilst not against democracy, because he's benefited from it, not against elections, would rather have less of it than more of it, it would seem. And that's translating into this campaign, the fact that a president is campaigning for one of the contestants and not one from his own party. I mean, the president campaigning for a candidate from his own party is perfectly straightforward in democracy. But he's done an end run, of course, around Ibu Megawati, and said, I'm not going to play by the PDIP Megawati playbook. I'm going to, push ahead and do my own thing. And of course, there's some plausible deniability, but not much. Basically, he's given his imprimatur to Prabowo. Prabowo is benefiting from it. And in one respect, that's legitimate given the contestation between Pak Jokowi and Ibu Mega. In other respects, the way it's playing out is fairly anti-democratic, particularly when it comes to using state institutional power and state institutions to engage in the campaign on the side of Pak Prabowo's campaign. So, that's not a damning record, but it certainly makes it clear that we're not dealing with a Democrat.
I think in this election, between the three candidates, they are trying to Anies Baswedan and the Amin team, and then Ganjar Mahfud is trying to frame the contest as a contest between ethics, those who value ethics and democracy, and those who are trying to violate ethics, and violate the norms and rules. And this was seen during the debates and in their cross-counter political rhetorics. I'm just wondering, is this what is at stake? Or is this the issue in Indonesian elections today? Or is this, or do you think that the grassroots, the general public sees it a different way, that that's not what is at stake here?
Well, if the polling we've been getting translates into votes as the way almost certainly is to be the case, because the margin of error is quite small and Prabowo's lead is quite strong, and has been consistently strong now, going back to April last year, then the public doesn't see things the way that we see things. The public has a different perspective. Now, that may change as people get energized again. But I think Anies has a point. The weakness of Indonesian democracy all along has been, certainly, since Reformasi began in 1998, a lack of commitment to policy and conviction politics. The one exception has been Islamist politics, where you have to say that is conviction politics. People have their convictions whether you agree with them or not. Of course, it's that element that's partly there in the support base of Pak Anies, although I don't think it reflects his own position. But there's a record of conviction politics on the Islamist side, and Pak Anies is trying to turn it into a more kind of civil religion direction in terms of values and ethics. That's to be applauded. I think on Pak Ganjar's side too, Pak Ganjar Pranowo is a Democrat, kind of a low energy Democrat who hasn't cut through and hasn't got excited the public, but he's committed to, from all the records that we can see, all the evidence, to a moderate pro-Pancasila, pro-democracy position. Unfortunately, he hasn't found a way of packaging it and making it really exciting, particularly when he was late to receive Ibu Mega's endorsements. PDIP the machinery hasn't been as effective as we'd hoped it would be for his campaign. And a very popular president has given his mandate to somebody else on his own terms. So yes, in a way, both Ganjar and Anies as contesting candidates against a very popular front-running candidate are contesting on the basis of values. And certainly Prabowo, whatever you say about him, is not campaigning on the basis of values. He's campaigning on the basis of, trust me, it'll be okay, we'll get things done. It's not the speech of a would-be authoritarian, but nor is it the speech of a Democrat.
Greg, I think somebody in or Prabowo himself probably in the Prabowo team decided that a key part of our strategy is just getting President Jokowi to support and endorse us, as you indicated, yeah. And whatever the political cost is, that's fine, because that is how we will win this election. So there is an assumption that President Jokowi's support is everything, and is the biggest asset that they need. I'm just wondering if we can just how true is this assumption? I know President Jokowi is said to have 80% approval rate, satisfaction rate, and so on. But how true does this translate into added electoral and political power for Prabowo?
Well, it translates in terms of popular support polling, and it may be that there's something else going on here that's eluded us that we're missing. But Prabowo has gone from being a would-be presidential, would-be president, a candidate who was sort of trying hard, but running behind, to somebody who's surging ahead. And perhaps there are a complex basket of factors behind this, but it does seem that the dominant factor is he has the mandate of a very popular president coming to the end of his 10-year tenure. And that's enough in times of relative economic stability to translate into people saying, okay, we'll go with this guy who we recognize and we know. To be fair to Pak Prabowo, we could judge him on the basis of quite a long record. I won't go back to the New Order period and his leadership of Kopassus and the human rights dark cloud that was over that period. But let's go through in the Reformasi period. He tried many times to be nominated as a candidate and wasn't successful. Finally, in 2014, he fought a pretty effective campaign. But as I noted earlier, that campaign began with classic populist imagery. He channeled both Mussolini and Bung Karno in his election campaign. Came close, but not close enough. Jokowi won, of course. And then ahead of the 2019 election, a popular interpretation that I share is that he saw the contest for the gubernatorial election in Jakarta in 2017 as being a chance to experiment with, mobilizing a different kind of base. And so the 212 movement of December 2016, which saw hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Jakarta, ended up unseating Ahok, and there was the terrible charges of blasphemy and all of the unfairness that went with that. Anies Baswedan became governor as a result. But in the background was Team Prabowo, sort of trying on something and seeing what worked. What's interesting is that they clearly came to the conclusion that actually that's not the way to go. So 2019, Prabowo has gone from being populist candidate in 2014 to being Mr. Statesman, Mr. International Statesman. Still didn't work in 2019. So 2024, suddenly he's way ahead. What's the difference? I think it's good that he's given up on the populist, Mussolini man on horseback, although the sort of natural instinct to be the strong man, the can-do leader is still there, I think. The difference, I think, is simply that he benefits from the mandate of a popular president in good economic times, and the other two contenders are not cutting through in a large enough fashion. Behind it, of course, this is the Shakespearean drama of Pak Jokowi and Ibu Mega. And of course, that is classic Shakespearean drama because it's personal conflict. Had Mega been more canny in supporting Pak Jokowi and got his support, we'd have a very different dynamic. Perhaps we're speaking about how, of course, Pak Ganjar is so popular. It's obvious he would be the good candidate. We're not having that conversation now. I think it's all about this, the role of Jokowi.
Yes. And Greg, you've done a lot of research on Islamic politics in Indonesia. How is Islam in politics different in this year's election compared to previous elections? Because I think in the last election, it was a factor. There was, the choice of the Ma'ruf Amin as the vice president was a reflection of the importance of Islamic politics. Yeah, how is it this time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that Pak Ma'ruf being vice president was quite as consequential as people see. I think that was more about blocking Pak Mahfud, who was, just about to be called in to the office and given the role, and was probably cut off by Ibu Mega or somebody from her team who saw him as being too threatening. So that's deeply ironic when you think about it today. Pak Maruf headed Majelis Ulama Indonesia, which has gone from being an instrument used during the Suharto period to control Islamists to being an instrument controlled by Islamists. So that doesn't actually give you confidence in Pak Maruf. But to be fair, as vice president, he's not really done anything consequential. So that's perhaps a strong endorsement for inaction. But you're right. Behind all of this is we had in 2014 Pak Prabowo trying to be this strong populist leader and sort of appealing to religion, trying it again with the 212 movement at the end of 2016, early 2017, backing away in 2019. But 2019 election was still pretty unpleasant. I mean, not as much black ops, I think, as 2014, but still unpleasant. And still this fear that religion would be used in a really instrumental way that would degrade sort of religious values and undermine things. As it happens, I think one bit of good news from this year's election at this point is we haven't seen that terrible polarization of the same degree. We haven't seen, even though we've got this ongoing tragedy in Gaza, which could have been weaponized in this year's election, I think, all candidates share concern about what's happening in Gaza, and there's not that great a difference in acknowledging that something needs to change there. And we're not seeing cheap political plays made on the basis of sectarian values. So in that sense, Indonesia's come a long way, and we've dodged a bullet. We could have a much worse situation than we currently have. The flip side is that we're dealing with, sleepwalking into a mandate for a man who may no longer be overtly channeling populism and no longer overtly flirting with Islamist sectarian interests. There's no Democrat.
Yeah. But Greg, I was in Philippines some weeks ago, and someone made a very interesting comment saying that, look, whoever is the president of Philippines is the oligarchy who ruled, and they stay, whoever is president. Yeah. I'm just wondering, from the outside, do you see a presence of oligarchy in Indonesia, collusion of interest also between the big conglomerate guys and the politicians, political elites? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because that has been a constant in Indonesian history, that a fairly small but powerful elite likes to protect status quo. We had a strange situation where Krismon back in '97 led to a crisis that Pak Harto was not able to resolve. And of course we had that tragic comic situation where he tried to form a new cabinet and couldn't get anyone to join, and so finally he resigned, expecting that Habibie would follow him. Habibie thankfully didn't. Habibie was a really transformative, transitional president, as was Gus Dur, but both of them were kind of accidental politicians pushing for reform in a system that didn't want reform, and getting pushback from a military and civil elite that tried to slow things down. And we saw that wave of resistance come during Mega's presidency. You know this better than anyone, but arguably during the second term of Pak Yudhoyono's presidency as well. In any case, it's a constant sort of ebb and flow in the system. And this time around, I think the collective consensus is that the oligarchy is happy with Jokowi's performance, would like to have it carrying on. Jokowi himself was probably tempted towards a third term, and then that option closed off. So endorsing Prabowo and hoping to have some enduring influence seems to be a personal motivation for Jokowi, but also a motivation for the oligarchy. It's not as extreme as it is in the Philippines, where the oligarchy literally is a land-owning superclass that determines everything. Indonesia, I think, thankfully, isn't as bound by that. But of course, there are parallels. The other parallel is when we saw Ferdinand Marcos Jr. campaigning for the presidency, we said this is a dire threat to democracy. And it turns out that Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos, hasn't been disastrous. He's done okay. He's certainly been better than Duterte before him. And so it may be that President Prabowo pleasantly surprise us by not being the Prabowo of old, but by being a moderate and inclusive figure. Of course, Bongbong is not his father. Prabowo is still the man who was the leader of Kopassus and has a long, dark, black record behind him. So, it's a different dynamic, but a less powerful elite. So perhaps that gives more chance for change.
Yeah. Talking about Bongbong, interestingly, he used tactics or strategies that are quite different than his opponents and his predecessors, especially what is called the TikTok elections in Philippines. And we're beginning to see that too. Prabowo with his Gamoy image was spread through TikTok, and at one point it dominated the TikTok hits. I'm just wondering, to what extent do you see social media really becoming an instrument that is game-changing elections?
Yeah, a really important question, particularly for this election, but also for this room, because you talk about social media, you're talking not exclusively, of course, but very much about youth, certainly about change. So we didn't have social media 20 years ago. It's something that is new. It functions in a different way. There were, famously, of course, it was thought that one of the reasons that John F. Kennedy did so well in the first televised presidential debate was that he was more telegenic. He understood television better than Nixon, who refused to take makeup and looked rather sort of old and ashen on screen. That was a turning point for new technology. Social media transforms things because we don't have to sit in our lounge rooms and watch television. We now sort of pick up our phone and look at it and just see the things that our social media algorithm gives us. We've seen it at play in elections all across the place. This year's election in India, it's at play. It's very much was play at Malaysia's last national election, where PAS did very well with TikTok, and the other parties really struggled. It was certainly the case with Bongbong Marcos that part of that successful campaign to whitewash the Marcos era and to sort of retell history was done through social media. And I don't think that Prabowo is going to be successful because he's Gamoy, but the Gamoy factor is on TikTok is that he's saying to a young, voting public, don't be afraid. Ignore those stories you heard about from old people about the previous times. Don't be afraid. This is just an uncle. Nothing to fear here. So he's gone from scary ex-general to cute uncle, and I can't explain that, but TikTok and social media in general is part of what's made that possible.
Greg, let's talk about populism. We see this in many elections now, and elections are won a lot by populism. This is probably the reason why Trump is eyeing a second victory in the United States, right? Populism. In Mexico, the president there has, I think, 80% approval rate. Bongbong was riding on it. Definitely Jokowi has his brand of populism here. I'm just wondering, how do you see the role of populism in Indonesian politics? And what is unique about Indonesian political populism relative to compared to other countries here?
Yeah, that's a good question. As it happens, I've just published a small, modest book on comparison of populism in Indonesia with Turkey. And it was one of those projects that seemed like a good idea at the time it started. And I was increasingly worried towards the end because Turkey is a classic case of populism. I mean, there's always caveats with this discussion of populism because the conceit of populism, the populists, is that they are the outsiders tackling the evil elite on behalf of the voice of the public, or, the masses. And of course, something like Tayyip Erdogan has been in power all his life, so he's not an outsider. But he nevertheless appeals to people in small towns and villages that have recently moved to larger cities by saying, "I'm your guy. You know, you were discriminated because you couldn't wear hijab. You were looked down upon because you're religious, but now I'll fight for you." And that's worked for Erdogan very, very well. In Indonesia's case, you know, Jokowi is popular, but he's not a populist. Prabowo tried to be a populist in a very classic sense in 2014, a decade ago, but he's not trying that populist stick today. He's not, as I said, an outsider speaking for the people, disrupting the evil elite. So Indonesia is a bit of an outlier. Donald Trump benefits from the court cases against him and the public anger because it gives him a way of saying, "I'm the outsider. You know, look at them. They hate me. They're against me. I am the outsider. I am your champion." After a while, of course, when you're in power, you start to lose that claim of being the outsider. So, look, Prime Minister Modi in India is certainly a populist, but he's not the outsider. He's very much now the insider. But he came to power against Congress and said, "I'm coming to represent ordinary Hindu Indians," and he's managed to keep that sort of narrative going. I don't think that's, you know, I don't think we understand Indonesia through the lens of populism. It's as a big narrative. It's elements of the way people present themselves. It was certainly a strong element in the 212 movement. So, you know, Pak Anies has had some experience of that, but he's backing away from that kind of populist approach. Prabowo is neither presenting himself as an outsider or an insider. He's just saying, you know, don't be scared. I'm going to keep on doing the good things that, you know, good Jokowi has been doing. Ganjar is not taking a populist approach. So in some ways, Indonesia is, you know, playing by a different script at the moment. The thing about populism is, you know, you need to be popular for it to be successful. So it wasn't successful in 2014 for Prabowo, and he's given a chance to do something different now, and the populist script doesn't work. It doesn't mean that in power that sort of instinct may not come back. And so, you know, we should be right to be concerned about what sort of democracy he might lead.
I noticed in the past that populism was used in a ways that a smack of xenophobic, anti-foreign sentiments. Yeah. But this year's elections, I don't see much of that. Although there's been some occasions of that, yeah. But I mean, is this what you see as well? Because, you know, Anies has talked about embracing the world. Ganjar also, you know, Prabowo also, while talking about populist messages.
Yeah, no, credit where credit is due. I was glad to see Prabowo changed his tune in 2019 and was trying to be international statesman. I'm glad that he's not going back to the old populist route today. I'm glad that Anies has backed away from the 212 movement populism. So that's good. And I think Indonesia's in a better place for all of that. Indonesia has other problems, other challenges, but it's not dealing with the scourge of, you know, simple populism and sectarian sentiment. This is a much less polarized campaign than we've seen in the past. So, you know, it's good and bad. This is part of the good. But Don will have views of that now that he's back with them, sure.
Don, how are you? Welcome back. I'm glad. I hope your internet is back working, and I hope you can hear me. If you can hear me, can you put your hand to your ear? Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good.
There's a block on the screen, and I'm reluctant to try to delete it for fear that that's going to throw everything out. But I can hear you.
Okay. Good. So, Don, please give us your take on the state of Indonesian democracy. That was the question when we got cut off. Yeah. Please, Don.
I'm sorry, what was the question?
What is your take on the challenges or the state of Indonesia's democratic development and also elections? Yeah.
Well, look, let me answer that in a rather unusual manner. I mean, Greg, I've been listening to the conversation so far, even though I haven't taken part in it. And I think Greg and you have covered a lot of the aspects of the election and so forth. So I would like to take a different tack on it, if I could. And I think you know me pretty well. We've known each other for a long time, you know. And you know that I tend to be a little bit of a contrarian. And if you don't mind, what I would like to do, I thought that you and Greg had a terrific conversation. It was very useful. I would like to do something rather different, because I want to remind the audience that the name of this session is "The View from Outside: How Indonesianists See Our Democracy, Elections, and Political Development." Now, I want to critique that as an academic. Because what I'm particularly interested in is the notion of Indonesianists. I am an Indonesianist, that's right, and Greg is as well. And actually, so are you. But I think there is perhaps a need to try to clarify conceptually what we're doing here by focusing on Indonesianists. Let me just make a couple of comments. First of all, the view from outside. Well, obviously, you know this as well as I do. There is no such thing as the view from outside. No, there are multiple views. I mean, not that many Americans are aware of the details of the Indonesian election, but if you explored what Americans think about the Indonesian elections, aside from the fact that many of them would not think anything because perhaps some of them don't even know that those elections are taking place, nevertheless, among the Indonesianist community, you would find different points of view, some more pessimistic. We remember, the notion of democratic decline came out of Indonesianists in Australia, and I think there are many people that probably would buy into that. At the same time, there are others much more optimistic about the future of Indonesia. And if I may say so, including myself, I'm not prepared to say that democracy is somehow outmoded. It's undergoing a difficult period. I was impressed with, this is something that Bill Little, who really should have replaced me on this panel, because he, of all the people in the United States who are Indonesianists, has had the longest acquaintance with Indonesian politics and democracy. But I am quoting from the article that some of your listeners, some of our listeners and watchers might have seen in Kompas in the 26th January issue just a few days ago, which I'm not going to read in its entirety, but I thought was very useful, including the following remark, based on an opinion coming from the Center for Political Science Studies at the University of Indonesia. And these two are Indonesianists, even though they're Indonesians living in Indonesia, right? I quote, "If Prabowo and Gibran win, all parties may think that it was a victory obtained dishonestly, so they will reject the election results. Once the election results are rejected, it is invalid." Well, actually, there's much more to say than that, and I'm sure that if we looked up the original quote, it would go on and on and on. But I do want to say that the involvement of the Constitutional Court, particularly in this affair, is particularly worrisome. And frankly, from an American point of view, an American, not the American point of view, there's no such thing. There is a parallel there with what we're looking forward to in November, our own election. Sometimes I think that whoever, survives this election in Indonesia would do well to get on an airplane and come to the United States and tell us how we can avoid what happened there, or maybe copy what happened there if the election in Indonesia turns out to be successful. So let me go back to the view from outside. Okay, there are multiple views. Second, what is outside, right? I'm talking about Indonesianists here. Is it geography, where you live? There are many Indonesians who live outside the United States, many of them, and who are also studying Indonesia. So the notion of the outside view already, it seems to me, has been, if not shattered, seriously, changed. But we have to consider the almost the globalization, if you will, of Indonesian studies. And I really want to emphasize that. And let me just give you a specific example of what I mean. This is in the context of looking at the election, but not focusing on the election. One example is a young woman named Amanah Murish. Her education, she's Indonesian. Her education included positions in Austria, academic positions, Utrecht University, Leiden in the Netherlands, Singapore, National University of Singapore, Temple University in the United States, Chulalongkorn University in Thailand. And this was all before she wrote her book, which I'd like to be able to show it to you, thinking that you can see it, although my own view is blocked. I'll show it to you. It's called Agama Jawa, Setengah Abad Pasca Clifford Geertz. Clifford Geertz, of course, being the well-known late anthropologist who discussed the notion that we're all, I think, familiar with the Santri, Priai, and Abangan distinction, which she takes as a young and modern Indonesian and an Indonesianist, because she is writing about Indonesia. That's her specialty, right? And takes it apart. She doesn't reject it entirely, but she improves it, she updates it, and so forth. And this is coming from someone whose academic career has involved from one university outside of Indonesia to another. And in fact, she will be here at Stanford. She's a Fulbrighter here at Stanford, and I look forward to having her for an academic year, and she will probably write more things about Indonesia. So how Indonesianists see democracy in Indonesia, well, I think that's an interesting issue. But the distinction between inside and outside is increasingly out of date. And it's a good thing that it's becoming out of date. But let's remember that the study of Indonesia began in colonial contexts. It was colonial officials, obviously, who were sort of, intellectually motivated, I suppose, although there was a lot of power behind their motivation, to study various aspects of Indonesia. And the days in which that scholarship was colonial are long since gone. Although one can ask questions about biases. And here we come back to democracy in Indonesia. The United States obviously considers itself a democratic country. And the temptation, therefore, is to think of democracy as something that everybody should hold dear. And so the backsliding and the declining of democracy, which is the common, I think, commentary that one sees not only in academia, but also in journalism here in the United States, the notion that democracy is on decline, that's bad news. And therefore, there is a desire to promote democracy, to defend democracy. I'm involved with such an institution here at Stanford, the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law. And all of them are important to many Americans, including myself. But it seems to me that the Indonesianist, whether he's Indonesian or she is American or any nationality at all, is also concerned with the context of Indonesia. Let me just give one example. The KPK, the Anti-Corruption Commission, it seems to me, has suffered rather grievously under the Jokowi administration, and this is very unfortunate, right? But there is an irony here. What is the irony? The irony is that one of the reasons why that operation succeeded is because it was powerful. It didn't just sort of reach a conclusion, oh, well, there's a little bit of corruption going on over there, so, maybe the Department of Justice should do something about that. No, they had powers that allowed them to go beyond that and to actually implement justice. Now, from a sort of standpoint that is very decentralized, right, and all power to the individual, and forget about institutions, because, we don't like institutions so much they tell us to do things we don't want to do, right? Which in an American tradition, the notion of cowboy democracy, right? My rights include my right to swing my fist just shy of your nose, which is insane, absolutely insane. It's insane here. It's even more insane in a wet rice society in Southeast Asia where people are crowded together and they can't afford that, right? That would be absolutely catastrophic. And so it's ironic that an organization, an institution that had power, and that power that it had made it work, it was better for Indonesia, it can be accused of having too much power. Well, maybe democracy, but democracy then reduces, if you will, the experience, the performance-based experience of actually doing something about corruption in Indonesia. So I'm going on at great length about this. There's one other thing I want to say, which is that I am optimistic about Indonesia. I do not believe that democracy is in Indonesia, not at all. I'm worried about democracy in the United States, very much so. But I don't think democracy in the United States is going to disappear either. And I want to turn you back to what happened just last night here on campus, just steps away from my office, when I met with Indonesian students who are at Stanford, and we met to talk about the election. And I want to emphasize the following thing, that the bijak memilih, which I dare say is familiar to many of your Indonesian watchers on this show, but I am embarrassed to admit was not familiar to me. Bijak memilih, which I suppose, one could say it's an organization, but it's also a network an informal set of individuals who have come together under the slogan, choose wisely, right? Bijak memilih, choose wisely. And you can see them online. And one of their leaders, actually, on a Zoom hookup to Jakarta, spoke. And it was absolutely mesmerizing and encouraging. And I must say, I'm playing with words here, but that's what I do enjoy doing. It was not just bijak memilih, it was pilih kebijakan. Choose policy, choose wisely, but choose policy. And so last night we got into a wonderful discussion with these Indonesian students. It was really outstanding. You know, how we focus on policy rather than on the personalities of the candidates, rather on, you know, the sort of identities. Identity politics can be so corrosive. It's corrosive here. I think it's corrosive in Indonesia as well. And here's the younger generation that, after all, will play a massive role. I mean, more than half of the voters in 2024 will be classified on how you count it as younger generation. So the younger generation has the future. And it seems to me this is precisely what that generation should be thinking. Policy, what is going to be done? I don't want to vote for someone just because they match my prejudices, you know, either my religious beliefs or some other aspect of a person's identity, which has not necessarily much of anything to do with actual policy. That seems to me constructive. So I'm an optimist. I want to cheer Indonesia forward toward the finishing line. And I don't think that democracy is really up for terrific, you know, damage in Indonesia. At least I hope not. Sorry.
Thank you, Pat Don. I want to ask you a question based on that, and perhaps Greg can also respond. And I agree with you just on the views. First, you and Pat Greg has a similar view that the glass is half full. Yeah. So that's important to recognize. Yeah. Secondly, with regard to the comments made by your students in Stanford, and I hear that in many the conversations in Jakarta, in coffee shops, in Starbucks, and so on. But there is a different processing if you go out deeper into Indonesia at the village level, yeah, at the grassroots and the provinces. The discussion about policy is less important, and sometimes processing of information is more at the surface level, so very simplistic. Yeah, perhaps this is why the Gamoy factor became important, because people saw a cute uncle, as Greg Barton see, and they don't go deeper into issues. Yeah. So is there any comment that you make? Maybe this explains the Trump effect as well, right? There is people in New York and DC see Trump a certain way. My friends in DC see Trump a different way. But there's another base. People that when I was in the U.S., I really didn't visit. People in certain states, and these they have different calculations, different way of looking at Trump. Yeah, I don't know if you have any comment on that.
I do. I really strongly believe that if we somehow attach the notion of policy to elites and assume that people who are at the bottom of the income distribution either are not capable of, or not interested in, or not oriented towards policy, and consign them to the roles of following the demagogues, and having their identity and so forth, right? All of that. It seems to me that we're doing a disservice to the Indonesian people. And for that matter, here in the US, we would be doing a disservice to people who happen to be low down on the, on the wealth list. But at the same time, policy affects people directly. For example, paying for school. How are you going to pay for school? Well, if there's a policy that allocates funds that, depending upon your need for such payment, right, for such fellowships, one can if you will, increase the opportunity through policy. This has to do with a decision that's made by the government, and funds are transferred, hopefully without any diminution due to corruption, to deserving individuals. And that way you develop an educational system that is much more effective than otherwise, not only just that you're taking talent from people who have talent, but don't have the background or the opportunity to express it, because the policies are not there to support them, right? And so the notion that policy is somehow an abstraction that operates at the university level, but not at the village level, it seems to me is wrong. Or at least that it should operate at the lowest possible level, because that's where people, they're worried about the impact. Do I have enough food to survive this particular season? When we get closer and closer to the parlous, really, basically, potentially horrific circumstances of the survival of the planet itself, right? Global warming, all of that. Then it seems to me policy becomes absolutely vital. And rather than thinking of that as something that academics should discuss in seminars in urban areas, it's important to bring that right down to the individual Indonesian in the rural areas as well, every bit as much. And to try then to encourage people based on policies that take that into account. I mean, take Ika and Nusantara, right, in East Kalimantan. We had a wonderful conversation last night about that policy. That's a policy matter. And the discussion was, is it worth it or not? Now, these were, of course, at Stanford University. So obviously they're not, the bottom of the barrel in terms of their educational attainments. But I'm sure that if we had had this meeting not here near my office at Stanford, but in
Hi, Don, are you there? Okay, Pak Greg, let me go to you while Pak Don is getting his internet fixed. Yeah, Pak Don, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Pak Greg, you're still there, right?
Sure. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So let me ask you this question. And back on policy and populism. Yeah. But I noticed in the last 8 or 9 years or so, optics has become extremely important in the Jokowi administration, right? Optics meaning how things are perceived in public. In fact, that's the first consideration for any policy discussion. What do I do to please the public and to make myself look spotless and good and so on? Yeah. And I'm sure every policymaker in any democracy pays attention to that. Yeah. But is there a point where those become two different things? Because I see several, or if not many, politicians, including ministers, where their main attention is, look, if I go to the office today, what do I do to get 1 million hits on my Instagram the next day, right? And when you think that way, what does that happen? You handle policy differently. Or perhaps you forget what was on your desk. You focus on the content creation to get that 1 million hits, right? I'm just wondering, how do you see this? Because I really don't believe that policy and optics all the time they go hand in hand. I think there are times, and plenty of times, whereby the optics become too much at the expense of policy, and you back down from making hard but necessary decisions, and you avoid addressing serious issues. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, but that is the great central question of democratic politics. Democracy is about an accountability mechanism that depends on popularity, after all, and polling. And it's natural to get sort of locked into electoral cycles and fixated on your polling. It's natural to have your staff do focus group discussions to see how you're traveling, to see, in the age of social media, it sort of accelerates Think of all the great television comedies written around politics. If some of our audience may be familiar with Yes Minister. I know it's an old school thing, but maybe the Veep or other things. We know that political life is all about trying to get your message out so people like you, so that they vote for you, so you return to office. And yet, at a certain point, it is corrosive. So, to be fair, going back to Don's point, like Don, I share optimism about Indonesian democracy, but I am concerned about the next phase. I think it's going to be challenging. And I think that a lot of people, if they do, as we expect, end up voting for Pak Prabowo to become president, it's not because they're fools or because they don't care. It's because they're basically saying, I like what Pak Jokowi has been doing. I want more of the same. And so that campaign is working for Jokowi. It's probably working for Prabowo. But at a certain point, substance catches up with you. So far, consistent economic growth, low inflation, high employment rates. It's been pretty good. If Indonesia faces some headwinds and under President Prabowo, maybe there'll be different issues to contend with. But I am concerned about, in any country, in any context. One sort of footnote here is that I agree with Don, even when he's being contrarian, maybe especially when he's being contrarian. That we should be optimistic about Indonesia. And I agree that there's a qualitative difference with democracy in America at the moment. It's facing in November this year a crisis point that is an existential threat to American democracy. Getting through a second Trump term will come with great cost if it happens. It's not something you really want to try. I think Indonesian democracy will get through a Prabowo period, but it may be a period in which this mismatch between image making and trying to be popular and the substance of policy delivery catches up. It may be that that will be what President Prabowo has to deal with, that he faces challenges that Jokowi hasn't faced so far.
Okay, good. But Don, can you hear me now? Are you back? Can you touch your ear if you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I heard Greg as well.
Okay, good. Maybe a question I want to ask you, but Greg, most welcome to comment further on this also. I get your point by Don that democracy will not crumble in Indonesia, not like Myanmar, where there was a coup, not like in Thailand, where there was a coup, or Egypt, where there was a coup, and so on. But the question is, and the debate is whether or not the quality of democracy is regressing in a way that there are bits and pieces at different points in time in aspects of democracy that are regressing. It can be in terms of freedom of speech, right? It can be the misuse of institutions, the misuse of the rule of law, and things like that. That will be at the expense of democratic life, but not in a blatant, explicit way, and not all at once, but in bit by bit creeping way. I'm just wondering if you think that there's a danger of Indonesia experiencing that. Yeah, so not not a crumbling of it, right? Not an overall assault and a decline, but bit and bit creeping Russia in different areas. Yeah.
I think you're right. The probability of an outright coup, sort of MR style, versus the incremental diminution, if you will, of effective democracy in Indonesia. You're absolutely right. It's what happens, imperceptibly, gradually, little changes in standards, for example, a tolerance of something that one might not have tolerated before. And let's remember how unsure the whole enterprise of democracy is. I mean, what other political system relies on uncertainty, right? The necessity, it's almost the sacred character of uncertainty. And what do I mean by that? because no one knows. We're talking about an election. No one knows who's going to win. And that uncertainty is necessary. I'm not saying that people shouldn't guess. I'm not saying people shouldn't have information that allows them to make predictions. No, but it's the uncertainty of the outcome that then emphasizes the importance of the process. And that, of course, then is based on trust. Trust in the institutions. The damage being done to American institutions by Trump is unspeakable, absolutely unspeakable. And I hope that's not going to happen in Indonesia. But you're right, that damage, if it is taking place, could be very incremental, but damaging in an extreme way as those little compromises go further in the direction of the absence of democracy altogether. So yes, I am definitely optimistic about Indonesia, but on the other hand, I'm not naive. I realize that these incremental issues are absolutely vital. I remember I was on a panel. You were there. Were you there? I think you were there. Well, anyway, you remember. And I was sitting next to the Chinese ambassador to Indonesia, and the subject came up of trust. And frankly, having probably attended far too many conferences where this came up, and typically the Chinese would stand up and say, "Why don't you trust us? Why don't you trust us? Why don't you trust us?" And then I guess the Americans would say, "Well, why don't you trust us?" And anyway, so the issue came up, and I turned to the ambassador. I was a little bit undiplomatic, I confess, and I said, "How can we trust you when you don't even trust your own people?" Right? Which is one of the definitions of an authoritarian regime. You don't trust your own people, right? And so to talk about successful democracy is to rely on things that are somewhat intangible and easily disturbed, right? If I can put it that way. Things like trust, the notion of uncertainty. Democracy there is no such thing as democracy as a permanent aim, a permanent goal, a permanent state of affairs. Democracy is a constantly changing experiment, day to day, month to month, year to year. And even a country like the United States that has had, democracy of a kind for centuries now, is still just an experiment in progress, which is, I suppose, depressing for people who want to solve a problem and then permanently solve it and not have to worry about it ever again. And if so, they shouldn't be in a democracy. They should go to an authoritarian system where the result of the election can be predicted well in advance. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Maybe I'm speaking a little bit too personally. I love Indonesia. I want it to succeed. I want democracy in Indonesia to succeed. I believe the younger generation has the capacity to make it succeed. I'm rooting for Indonesia, but you're right. I am aware of the difficulties on the road.
Thank you, Greg. I wonder if you have anything to add. And before you add something, I also want to ask you one thing that worries me, to be honest, as an Indonesian with 3 young kids. This new criminal code law, that will be operational, I think, in 2026, and the architect of that law now is I think in jail or being processed for taking bribes or something like that. And besides that, what I see is, and many of the activists also see, it contains a lot of authoritarian tendencies. Right? You can go to jail for insulting the president. What does that mean, insulting the president? Right? Where's the line? And so many things. You need police permit to protest, right? Yes, you do. But what if the police are under the control of somebody else, and that means you can't protest freely, and so on and so on. There are just so many things about that law, the new criminal law that is disturbing. I'm just wondering what happens when that law comes into effect in Indonesia, and being misused even more by those who really want to abuse or hold on to power as much as they can. Yeah. So, or do you think my concerns are overrated? Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I certainly don't think your concerns are overrated, but Dino, I think we should always be concerned about the diminution of democratic institutions and means by which governments are held to account and by which individual rights are respected. That image that comes to mind, of course, is the image of the frog in a saucepan where the water is slowly heated. The frog gets comfortably warm, doesn't jump out, but too late and the water's boiling and it's killed. Incremental change can catch us out, death by 1,000 cuts, as it were. And yeah, the attacks on the KPK and now on KPU, it's very worrying to see this sort of institutional undermining. The new criminal code, to be fair, is essentially a repackaging, a reworking of the old Dutch era criminal code. It just failed to make the progress we hoped it would make. In areas that you've identified, but of course another area that is troubling is about people's personal relationships, which means that individuals can have that weaponized against them. Women in particular are likely to be victims where somebody launches a campaign against them, perhaps to blackmail them, perhaps to force them to marry them or something else, because of laws about personal morality, relationships, sexuality that can be used as an instrument to cudgel them. So that I think we should be concerned about those sort of things. I think we should be concerned about the distortion of the Constitutional Court. In a way, I don't mind the fact that Gibran is a vice presidential candidate. Whether he has much influence as vice president remains to be seen. Whether that gives his father much authority remains to be seen. Those are open questions. But of course, the manner in which he became vice president by making an exception that allowed him, opening a loophole, allowed him to step through with the clear hand of his father involved, that's what people are concerned about. Not most voters, of course. It's just sort of policy wonks who pay attention to this. So it's obviously not the mainstream issue. But I think all of these things we should be concerned about. Let me put it in a bigger frame, though. One of the structural factors that's contributed to the decline of democracy, I think there has been democratic regression. We can debate how far it's gone, but one of the structural factors is we've had good years of good economic growth and stability and a popular president with no strong opposition. And it's partly a product of the lack of conviction politics in Indonesia, politics around policy. But we've had a national unity sort of government that's had everyone on board, hardly anyone outside. There's hardly any opposition. What's left outside is not strong enough to be in opposition. If we see President Prabowo moving in an authoritarian direction, then the only way to hold that to account will be a strong opposition outside his government. I think one of the dangers, a subtle, insidious danger, may well be that he tries to get everyone inside, so no one can be outside. So we don't have a strong opposition. I think it's interesting to think about, and this is not personal criticism of Prabowo, but he's not young. He may be Gemoy, but he's certainly not young, right? Whatever young people think about him. And in 5 years' time, if he's president and is facing a contest for a second term, a combination of age and health, and also perhaps concerns about democracy, may mean that he is actually up in a hard contest to be re-elected. If people vote for him this year because they project their wishful thinking onto him, in 5 years' time, they may have reason to sort of be much more critical. Whether or not that leads to fresh democratic vigor and contest depends on whether there's a strong opposition. So to those who are pessimistic about a Prabowo presidency and say, we're going backwards, I would say, well, you've got to fight for what you believe in. And but for the next 5 years, the opposition is going to be really important. And there will be another election coming around. There'll be a chance to make the case. That's kind of an optimistic take, but it's also a realistic take, I think.
Okay. Before I take some questions from the chat room, I want to ask Pat Don and Greg this interesting question. Do you think these days democracies, both in the North and the global South, are more reluctant to criticize each other or to remind each other when they see something not going right? I remember because there were times that whenever we sneezed in the wrong way, I would get a knock from some embassy and or some foreign ministry or whatever, say, hey, we're concerned about this, about that. But now, without me going into specifics, I see a different trend. I'm just wondering, do you see this, or is that's again that's not the right way of seeing it? Yeah. So democracies, both in the North and the South, are more reluctant to remind each other when things need to be said.
Who's the question for?
Both of you. Pardon, you may want to take a first shot at it. Yeah.
Well, that opens up a whole other topic, and actually it's a very relevant topic because of the initials under which we are operating. FPCI, the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, and foreign policy is an important aspect of democracy in many respects. I'm not saying it's more important than domestic issues, no, but it is important. And I think, an example here would be there has been some opposition among so-called realists to the tendency of Joe Biden, the American president, to make this sweeping distinction between democracy and autocracy. I mean, in the past, at one point, I think he said something to the effect that, that's the real, defining, I'm not sure if he used the word Cold War, but that's essentially what he was implying. And the global South versus the global North is a completely different criterion for distinguishing countries. In which the presence of democracy, which, yes, admittedly, it does exist in the global South, but it's perhaps more prominent in Western Europe, United States, and so forth, in countries in the global North. That's an issue partly of ideology, partly of the political structure that exists in different countries. That's a different kind of question. And so the issue for me, the BRICS. The BRICS is a good example of a global South-oriented group that is really not interested in democracy or in the distinction between democracy and autocracy. Now, admittedly, I stands for India, but Indian behavior under Modi is in some respects anything but democratic. If you mean by democracy simply, the tolerance of other points of view. I mean, the Hindutva that he is following in India is really inimical, it seems to me, to a democracy based on respect for minorities, including the Muslim minority. I mean, come on, right? Will the global South survive? I mean, an effort to pick up the strand of a non-aligned movement, in which, I always remember the case of, we used to call it Burma, right? That Burma was not only not aligned with East or West, they had exited even the non-aligned movement. They were not aligned with being non-aligned. I mean, and we used to laugh about that. But the effort to revive that part of the past, it seems to me, is not going to succeed. It's rather naive. We're moving into a world that consists of groups of countries that are not easily defined in that sweeping way between the global North on the one hand and the global South on the other. And yes, I mean, democracies are certainly free to criticize each other. It's interesting, if we look at the mess, this is what FPCI is all about. I mean, Dino, I'm sure you've done many exercises. One of the most amazing things about what you have done with FPCI is that in a way you have democratized Indonesian foreign policy, at least to the extent that you have brought it down to people, not just pointy-headed intellectuals like ourselves, but real people on the streets, right? And people, who cram into now maybe they get credit, from their high schools in order to attend, perhaps, but never mind. I mean, the notion that foreign policy should remain the purview of an elite that is not engaged in interactions with the mass of ordinary Indonesians, that's not healthy, it seems to me, for a democracy. But then what is a democratic foreign policy? Obviously, the classic American case of trying to create democracy in countries that frankly may not want it, and in which that effort to create, I mean, how many times has the United States been implicated in what amount to seizures of power to oust dictators with often horrific consequences? But I think the intersection, the interaction between foreign policy and domestic politics, particularly with regard to democracy, is absolutely fascinating. I'll just end on this point. You know, we talk about ASEAN, but we don't talk about the differences within ASEAN that make it so difficult for ASEAN to act as if it were a single country. I mean, consider the subcontinental north, the sort of landed north, and the maritime south within ASEAN. And we know that with the exception of Brunei, the maritime south is where you will find, you know, to relative degrees, democracy, or at least some form of liberalism. And it's in the landed, no coast, well, except for Vietnam, in the north that you find the authoritarian pattern. And I don't think that's a mistake, because if you're on the coast, you're more open to opinions and people, and ideas and trade and so forth from all over the world. And therefore, it's harder to be a cosmopolitan in that sense in the north if you're Laos and you're a completely landed country, especially, you know, so near to China, which is hardly a paragon of democracy. And rather than sort of say, well, this difference is bad because it splits ASEAN, one might look, and this is my last proposal, to what is now being called mini-lateralism. Now, mind you, mini-lateralism is being blamed on the Biden administration, you know, ganging up AUKUS, you know, the United States, you know, all of that. The Quad, China is very upset with the way in which mini-lateralism is developing. But on the other hand, a mini-lateralism that brings the relatively democratic countries of the ASEAN region in the southern portion, right, in the maritime portion, into some kind of constructive interplay, for example, with regard to freedom of the seas in the South China Sea, right, which is a critical issue. That, it seems to me, is not something to be, oh no, we can't do that, because no, it has to be ASEAN. Well, if it's ASEAN, that means that any one country can veto. And that's evidence of that, right? The Cambodian veto has damaged the ability of ASEAN to have its own, you know, constructive policy. Now, ASEAN has done very well in economic terms, I admit, and I'm skating over that. I think these are opportunities for looking where democracy has benefits that extend, as I said earlier, to the very important policy realm. Policy really matters. If ASEAN is just about identity, forget it, it's doomed, because there's not enough in common. Southeast Asia is what, the most diverse region perhaps in the entire world. But if that difference between democracy and autocracy can support policies that are constructive and helpful and make sense, then I think more power to it.
Thank you, Greg. I wonder if you want to add, you want to respond to it. Do you think democracies are more reluctant to speak up?
Just briefly, Dina, because I know we're so short on time. We're living through a strange period in history, and let's be honest. Go back to the middle of last decade. Western democracies were pretty cocky to the point of being arrogant and very fond of telling other parts of the world how to have good governance, how to be democratic. And then we had Brexit, we had Boris Johnson, we had Liz Truss, we had Donald J. Trump. Suddenly, I don't think Western democracies are so confident about the fact that they can control things and get good outcomes. You know, it's been a humiliating period. Of course, the rise of Xi Jinping in China has been another sort of difficulty. There's limits to what you can do there, but then that's also having its own strange twist as Chinese demographics are reversing, the population is shrinking, the economy is in trouble. Nothing seems so certain anymore. And so I think there's less confidence about the ability to change things and perhaps a bit more humility. So going back to your time, Dino, you had the good fortune and the misfortune of living through a time when Western democracies thought they could give you advice. If you ran the tape again today, I don't think they'd bother because there are bigger fish to fry, you know. So that's good and bad. I do wish, though, that the world paid more attention to this election in Indonesia. I think it's not getting the attention it deserves. And I think that it's a complicated story that people don't understand well. We ourselves are struggling with trying to explain what's going on. But it's not just a moment in time. I think, holding governments to account, holding friends to account is still an important thing. And if we do have a Prabowo presidency, which is less democratic, more inclined to being authoritarian, less supportive of, for example, elections for governors and other positions, then I think the future of Indonesia will depend upon an opposition, or at least a civil society, coming together and saying, no, that's not good enough. We need to do better. And I think that you don't need old white guys in the West telling you what to do, but I think everyone who cares about Indonesia will need to pay attention to these things.
Thank you. Actually, I was hoping that when the insurrection against the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. happened on January 6th, the Indonesian government would say something, would express concern at this, but unfortunately that wasn't said not by Indonesia, and also not by many countries, including in the West. I thought that was kind of strange. It was an attack on democracy, and it was happening to us. I'm sure they would say something. So that's just my comment. There's a question from Satrio Santoso from Ateneo de Davao University. What is the significance of the undecided voters in these elections in February? How much do they matter? Maybe Pak Greg, you want
Sure,
to?
okay.
Yeah.
The couple of things we can say. One is that polling suggests that the number of people who are reporting that they're undecided is quite low, and that's kind of good in a way. It's a positive sign. In countries like Australia, where you have compulsory voting, you goal put so you don't pay a fine. In Indonesia, you don't have to goal put. I guess the reason people in the past, you're going back to the Suharto era, you had to turn up and vote, so it was compulsory, and therefore the only way you could protest was by putting an invalid vote in. I hope people understand they're living in a democracy. If they don't want to vote, they don't have to go to the polls and vote. But I think we should be encouraged by the high turnout of voting in Indonesia. I think that's a good sign. And if you're going to bother to go to the trouble of turning up, and after all, what is a polling booth where everyone knows your name? That's the beauty of the Indonesian system. It's kind of big country, but small, intimate settings. I think it's important to take things seriously. This is actually less consequential this year in Indonesia than it is in America. But if America ends up with a second term of Trump, it'll be because a lot of people have said, well, Biden did the wrong thing when it came to Middle East policy. That's another whole conversation in itself, by the way, where he let down the black church, or he let down Democrats. So why bother with Biden? And then it'll be people who turn out enthusiastically to vote for Trump that'll make the difference. That's a simple example of where our vote counts, and it's foolish to disregard that. By the way, just numerically, if Trump is re-elected, it'll be a handful of people in a handful of states and a handful of districts that will make the difference. So people say my vote doesn't matter, but actually often it comes down to small numbers making a big difference. Just ask Al Gore about that, for example. So in Indonesia, it's probably not going to be such a fine-grained affair. But yeah, Don is right. Policy matters. The cost of education, access to healthcare, those are things that have improved in Indonesia and gone backwards in America, but they matter. And it makes sense to turn out and vote for people. Maybe you get it wrong. Maybe you're wishful thinking about your candidate, but at least it makes sense to engage. And then if they let you down, you've got a basis for campaigning against them and holding them to account. But disengaging means we rob ourselves of that chance to hold them to account.
Okay. There's another question here. What do you think about the prospect for reforms in Indonesia after the elections? And which candidate you think are most likely to bring further reforms rather than less reforms?
Just briefly, because I'm sure John's going to answer, but polling suggests we're looking at a Prabowo presidency, whether it happens next month or happens in June. It's likely to be the case. So let's assume that's the case. I think Prabowo's instinct is he's not a Democrat, so he's less likely to push for reforms. So if we see reforms during his presidency, it'll be because of popular pressure, not because that's his instinct. And so that's going to have to be really hard fought for. We have seen regression. We're likely to see a further regressing during the Prabowo presidency, but it's not hopeless. If enough people either inside his cabinet or in opposition say, no, we've got to do some things, he, as we discussed earlier, wants to be popular, wants to be liked, that might be enough to make him do the right thing, but people will have to work for it.
Don, do you have any thing to add on this question?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Greg said. Well taken. But at the same time, it does seem to me that when we talk about reform and we think in terms of policymakers and why don't the policymakers engage in reform, we shouldn't leave, and forgive me, this may sound like a special pleading as an academic, but we shouldn't leave not just the society in general out of the picture. And Greg is right. I mean, if things go bad under Prabowo, one can hope that there will be a mass movement that will, in some sense, demand reform, I guess. But, here are all these intellectuals in Indonesia, not just in the West, obviously, in Indonesia, not just the ones in universities, but really smart people that may be working for a company or working for a government or whatever, who have the capacity to generate ideas. And it seems to me when we talk about the need for reform, we should perhaps begin by talking about the scarcity or presence or, availability of ideas, which is what reform really is all about. And particularly if, as we were discussing earlier, if the danger is incremental in nature, so that things gradually get worse. It's not like a black swan, right? It's a gray rhino. Little by little, they get worse, and nobody noticed until it was too late. And the opportunity for individuals that are not politicians, who have to tailor their remarks to constituencies that may believe A but disagree on B, then it seems to me it's up to people who are relatively outside of the political arena to engage in creative thinking about what could be done and how it could be done. And that thinking should not be dismissed as idealistic or unrealistic. I mean, no, I think on the contrary, it's crucial that in the hot box of contested politics, I want to win, right? As if that were the only thing that mattered. These longer term considerations are absolutely vital. And they're massive examples. Take, for example, artificial intelligence, right? And the effort in Indonesia to avoid the kind of damage that these social media can intentionally or unintentionally accomplish. I mean, Elon Musk, my God, I mean, what a disastrous gift to the world that is in terms of the damage that can be done electronically through information. But again, it's a very technical issue. But rather than the engineers sort of thinking, well, we want to make this more powerful, one ought to think in a different way. How can we moderate it without censoring? Now, censorship, it seems to me, actually, some sort of censorship may actually be necessary. There may be certain invitations to violence that have to be banned completely, right? But how are you going to do that, right? And the how then shouldn't be, well, you do it powerfully or you do it, by calling up somebody and saying it needs to be done. No, you take the structure of government in Indonesia and you ask, where are the levers that could be pressed that would move in the direction of some kind of a consensus that the communication through social media in Indonesia, especially with all of the new wrinkles that are coming along, I live in Silicon Valley. And sometimes I wish they would all take a break, and sleep late rather than developing these new fantastic methods that, you remember the old saying in Silicon Valley, move fast and break things. I'm sorry, that's a catastrophic bit of advice. So anyway, I'm just saying that there's an opportunity for intellectual input in terms of the ideas that can go into reform. And hopefully I'm not being too optimistic there.
Thank you. I would love to entertain more questions, but I've been told that we are at the end of this conversation. Let me just make this one concluding observation. I've been lucky enough to experience the old days. I worked for the Suharto government, but also then worked for various governments during the Reformasi era. And I noticed we've had the pleasant opportunity to experience the Indonesian surprise, what I would call it. Yeah, Indonesian surprises. In 1998, Indonesian surprise was after long years, Suharto was brought down, and we had a new movement of reformasi and democracy, which really changed our history. It didn't go very well in the beginning, but starting for 2001 until 2004, Megawati and Yudhoyono presidency, the next Indonesian surprise was that, hey, this democracy stabilized and became a functioning democracy, and a lot of things were resolved, and so on. So that was the second surprise. And 2014, we had the third surprise, good surprise, which is somebody from totally outside became Indonesian president, not a political elite, not a military, not a conglomerate, but somebody who brought a new brand of populism, President Jokowi. So that's the third surprise. And he was re-elected again in 2019. So as we head to Indonesian elections on 14 February, whether or not it will be one round or second round, we are still yet to see. But I'm still optimistic to see an Indonesian surprise 4.0, the fourth Indonesian surprise. Pak Greg and Pak Don mentioned the glass half full and so on. And I agree. Whoever will become president will be Prabowo or Ganjar or Anies. I think that Indonesian surprise will manifest itself in different ways, in a good way. Yeah, it's a hope. It's not a scientific prediction. Yeah. But I've seen enough happenings in Indonesian history in the last few years, 20 years or more, to feel that I think the fourth Indonesian surprise will be coming. If it's going to be President Prabowo, perhaps, as Pak Don says, the circumstances and the civil society and other factors will work to make sure that he doesn't turn his back on reforms and so on. Yeah. So that's by way of concluding remarks. I want to thank Pak Don and Pak Greg for their very useful and valuable insights. And this is, by the way, the first in I think 4 or 5 series of conversations with Indonesianists abroad. And Pak Don asked, why was it necessary? It's because we read Indonesian commentaries every day, and sometimes it's just nice to hear somebody who lives outside the country and not exposed to what we expose on a daily or hour-to-hour basis. And it's quite refreshing to hear your viewpoints. And I'm sure this is going to be something that the general public will hear more of it. We're going to make small video clips out of your comments and spread it to the public. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you for your friendship and attention on Indonesia. And we'll stay in touch. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Take care.
Thanks very much, Pak Dino.
Thank you, Dr. Dino. Before we wrap up the event, I would like to invite all the speakers and everyone else to join a short photo session. Once the comedy is ready, you can turn on your camera. Okay. On my count, 1, 2, 3. Okay, one more time. 1, 2, 3. Thank you, everyone. And also, thank you for all the speakers. It has been a fruitful discussion. Thank you for all the speakers and Dr. Dino for sharing your incredible insights. I'm sure the audience found this session interesting and highly informative. Today's event will be available to be rewatched on FPCI official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in on today's discussion. You can follow our social media handles for more information about our activities, events, and programs, and also stay tuned for our next virtual public forum on Indonesianists via our Instagram or Twitter at FPCindo. See you at the next FPCI event and enjoy the rest of your day.